Perhaps the most unsettling question is not why civilizations fall, but why some vanish so completely that even time seems unwilling to remember them. There are places where the earth feels heavier, as if holding on to a memory it refuses to share, and where silence is the only witness left. And in that silence, a strange feeling lingers that something important slipped through the cracks of history long before we ever learned to name ourselves. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm building here. And if you don't mind, share where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. There is a moment when looking at the long arc of human history where the familiar narrative suddenly thins out. It is not a clean edge, not a line where knowledge stops and ignorance begins, but rather a drifting haze, a soft unraveling of context. Tools appear before the settlements they were supposedly crafted in. Trade goods show up thousands of kilometers beyond any known trade route, and sometimes, in the quietest layers of the earth, entire cultures emerge fully formed, as if they began not from a slow accumulation of skill and memory but from a jump, a leap, that no one can quite explain. In these moments, the questions rise naturally. What came before, and why did it leave without saying a word? The problem begins with absence. Not the absence of people. Bones and hearths and broken pottery remind us they lived. But the absence of transitions, the missing steps that would have led from one stage of development to the next. Consider Çatalhöyük, one of the oldest known proto-cities. By all logic, it should be surrounded by a scattered prehistory of smaller, simpler settlements, gradually increasing in complexity. Instead, it appears almost suddenly around 7400 BCE, densely populated, structured, ritualistic, and hauntingly sophisticated. The art on the walls carries symbolism that suggests a long cultural evolution behind it. Yet those earliest stages remain stubbornly silent in the soil. Then there is Göbekli Tepe, the place that should not exist according to earlier historical models. Massive T-shaped pillars, aligned with celestial patterns, covered in reliefs of animals that likely carried layered symbolic meaning. A monument requiring organization, planning, and a labor force far exceeding what one would expect from hunter-gatherer groups. And yet, there it is, older than pottery, older than agriculture, older than any permanent settlement we can confidently date. If civilization is a ladder, Göbekli Tepe is a rung without the rungs beneath it. Even more puzzling, it was deliberately buried, a careful act, not the chaotic collapse of a dying culture. What reason could there be for a people to hide the very monument that defined them? Across the world, similar contradictions whisper from different soils. In Tel Caramel, stone towers appear thousands of years before similar structures elsewhere. In Jericho, layers of destruction and rebuilding create a timeline that feels more cyclical than linear, as if a memory of an old order kept reasserting itself whenever new inhabitants arrived. These inconsistencies do not prove anything definitive, but they introduce a quiet discomfort, a sense that what we call the beginning may have been merely one beginning among others. Archaeology often presents itself as a science of objects. But beneath that discipline lies an even more delicate art, interpreting silence. The layers of earth that hold no artifacts at all can be as revealing as those filled with tools and bones. When a settlement grows suddenly without evidence of gradual development, silence speaks. When a technology appears centuries before the infrastructure that should support it, silence speaks. When symbolic systems arise fully formed without a chain of simpler predecessors, silence speaks again. And each time, the silence points toward a history that feels cropped, edited, or interrupted. Some scholars frame these gaps as normal variations in preservation. Not every artifact survives, not every structure withstands erosion, not every organic material fossilizes, but others, though cautious, suggest that the pattern is too persistent, too widespread to dismiss entirely. Why do we see so many abrupt beginnings? Why do certain ideas, technologies, and cultural forms appear almost as intrusions rather than evolutions? Could there have been earlier civilizations whose traces lie beneath layers we have not yet reached, or perhaps beneath coastlines swallowed by the sea after the last glacial melt? The end of the last ice age, around 11,600 years ago, brought with its dramatic rise in sea levels, enough to submerge vast coastal plains where early humans likely lived. More than 20 million square kilometers of land disappeared beneath the oceans. If coastal communities existed, and there is evidence suggesting they did, then their stories now lie under layers of silt, sand, and water, far beyond the reach of most archaeological methods. In that buried world, there might have been villages, harbors, workshops, maps carved on driftwood or stone, and all of it could have vanished so quietly that we only sense its ghost in the abruptness of what followed. Yet the puzzle deepens when we look at human memory, myths, legends, epics. Cultures from Mesopotamia to Australia speak of earlier ages, earlier peoples, earlier structures lost to cataclysm. While myths are not literal history, they often preserve psychological impressions of events too large to forget completely. A flood here, a collapse there, a migration from a land that no longer exists. These stories, when placed beside archaeological anomalies, create a resonance that is hard to ignore. Not proof, not certainty, only resonance. And perhaps that resonance is enough to unsettle the idea that our timeline is complete. Because what history refuses to say directly, it sometimes hints at through patterns. Civilizations do not usually vanish without leaving transitional layers. Cultures do not typically emerge with full symbolic systems unless something preceded them. Technologies do not appear without experimentation, and experimentation does not happen overnight. So why then do so many origins look like restarts rather than beginnings? And how many times have humans, or pre-humans, or near-humans, stood at the edge of complexity before stepping back into the shadows? In the quiet hours of the night, when the mind softens and the edges of certainty blur, it becomes easier to imagine that the earth itself has a memory, one older than any inscription and deeper than any excavation trench. A memory that unfolds slowly, reluctantly, allowing us to glimpse only fragments of what came before. And if those fragments do not align neatly with our preferred story of progress, perhaps that discomfort is itself a clue that the story we inherited is missing more than we realize. What remains then is a single open question. If entire civilizations could fade without leaving a clear trace, what else might be waiting in the layers below our feet, still holding its breath, still refusing to return to the light? There are moments in archaeology when an object refuses to fit into the timeline it is assigned. A layer of soil dates one way, but the structure rising from it suggests another. And in those moments, the past begins to feel less like a steady path, and more like a palimpsest, a manuscript written, erased, and written over again. What emerges from that layered confusion is not a single origin story, but a quiet hint that our beginnings may have been multiplied, staggered, or perhaps even interrupted. The deeper scholars dig, the more these contradictions accumulate, as though the earth is whispering that it remembers far more than we have learned to ask. The places where this becomes most apparent are the cities that seem older than their own dates, older even than the civilizations that supposedly built them. Jericho is often called the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, but beneath its Bronze Age walls lie earlier towers, earlier fortifications, earlier domestic structures that look strangely developed for their age. The pre-pottery Neolithic levels reveal construction techniques that appear, with a confidence hard to reconcile with a supposedly emerging society. It is not the age alone that unsettles researchers, it is the sophistication. As though the builders had inherited knowledge from a source we no longer have access to. A lineage of skill wiped clean from the archaeological ledger. This sense repeats across different regions. At Tel Caramel near the Euphrates, archaeologists unearthed 5 circular stone towers dating back to around 11,000 BCE, older than the famous Tower of Jericho, and constructed at a time when most models of human development insist such architecture should not exist. Yet the towers stand defiantly, their stones weathered but precise, their purpose elusive, defensive, ceremonial, observational. No explanation fits comfortably. Their existence alone suggests that organized architecture and perhaps even collective identity began earlier than we once believed. And still, there are no clear predecessors to these towers. They rise like islands in a sea whose continent has disappeared. Even more perplexing are the sites whose cultural layers do not ascend gradually, but instead flare brightly and then darken. At places like Seyonya in southeastern Anatolia, unique architectural layouts, including the so-called grill plan buildings, appear suddenly in the archaeological sequence. The people here practice complex rituals, possibly including forms of early ancestor veneration, indicated by carefully arranged skulls and deliberate patterns of restructuring. But after a time, these practices vanish, replaced by entirely different cultural habits. The shift feels abrupt, too abrupt for natural evolution, as if a community had not merely changed, but restarted. Some propose straightforward explanations: climate shifts, migrations, economic changes. These factors undoubtedly shaped the ancient world, but the question is not merely why a culture changed. It is why the earliest stages are so often missing altogether. Why do we see polished expressions of societal complexity without the rough drafts that should accompany them? If civilization is a long river, where are the smaller tributaries that ought to feed it? There is a growing idea among certain researchers, not mainstream but not fringe either, that ancient cities might be built atop remains so old and eroded that conventional archaeology cannot easily detect them. Erosion, tectonic uplift, sedimentation. These processes can erase entire epochs of architecture. Consider that in some parts of the world, a stable landscape can accumulate a meter of sediment every few thousand years. In others, flooding events bury entire settlements overnight. If smaller, earlier structures existed, time may have shredded them into unrecognizable fragments. Yet the sudden appearances remain hard to dismiss. Too many cities emerge mature, as though their founders were following blueprints inherited from an older narrative. And then there is the matter of repetition. Cities rebuilt atop older versions of themselves, often again and again, until the deepest layer becomes unreachable or is simply forgotten. Eridu, one of the earliest Sumerian cities, is a prime example. Beneath the visible ruins lie 18 earlier levels, each one a rebuilt iteration of the same temple. To the Sumerians, Eridu was the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven. Archaeologically, it is a stack of civilizations, each built on the memory of a previous one. But even at its lowest, oldest layer, the structure appears too complete, too deliberate, as if the first builders were themselves remembering something. Jericho follows a similar pattern. Walls rebuilt, towers reimagined, domestic layouts shifting yet echoing older forms. This cyclical construction gives the impression of urban memory, a tradition passed down not through writing, but through repetition. Yet the earliest cycles still feel like echoes of something earlier still. If these cities were built on memory, what was the original memory built on? Scholars sometimes hint at lost cultural precursors, a cautious academic phrase implying earlier groups whose material traces have vanished. But the scope of these missing predecessors grows increasingly difficult to confine. Why do so many early cities appear as though their founders began already knowing how to build a city? Why do certain architectural motifs appear across distant regions with no known connection? Circular towers, megalithic alignments, hearth-scented dwellings. Coincidence is possible. Parallel evolution is possible, but parallel forgetting. When the same pattern emerges in multiple corners of the world, the question becomes less about coincidence and more about possibility. Could multiple ancient cultures be inheritors of a memory older than themselves, perhaps preserved through oral traditions so ancient that they slip beyond the reach of archaeology? We do not know. But the faint suggestion lingers in the layout of houses, the placement of walls, the orientation of early ceremonial sites. Knowledge without origin, skill without visible ancestry, a whisper of continuity without context. The Indus Valley, though better known for its disappearance, also challenges assumptions about its beginnings. Harappa and Mohenjo-daro did not slowly evolve from primitive clusters. They appear as mature cities, with standardized brick sizes, drainage systems, urban planning, and water management far ahead of their time. It's as if the first chapter of their urban story is missing, torn out, or misfiled somewhere the earth has not yet shown us. The more these examples accumulate, the more the early chapters of human civilization feel less like voids and more like deliberate absences, as though time presents us only with the final version of each story, obscuring the drafts that would explain everything. And so, a quiet question arises. If these cities carry shadows of predecessors we cannot see, how many civilizations might have risen and fallen before history learned to notice? The soil answers only with a silence that feels too heavy to be empty. There are landscapes where the wind feels older than the ruins it touches, where the sand carries a weight of secrecy that no monument ever fully reveals. The desert has always been a keeper of memories, but not in the way forests or rivers remember. It remembers through erasure, through the quiet burial of everything that once lived beneath its shifting skin. And in these vast stretches of silence, civilizations flicker in and out of existence like mirages, real enough to disturb the imagination, yet elusive enough to resist the grasp of certainty. It is here, beneath dunes and heat and endless horizons, that some of humanity's most troubling absences lie. The Sahara, now a sea of dust and shimmering heat, was not always a barren world. For thousands of years it was green, full of grasses, rivers, lakes, and the wandering paths of animals now long gone from its borders. During the African humid period, the desert was a place of life, not death. And scattered across its surface are the remnants of people whose names we do not know, whose cities we cannot locate, whose stories survive only in the faintest traces. The puzzle is not whether they existed. The puzzle is why they left so little behind, as if an entire chapter of human history dissolved when the rains retreated. At Nubta Playa, deep in the southwest corner of Egypt, the stones form patterns that should not exist at their age. Arranged in circles and lines, some aligned to astronomical events, the site suggests a community capable of both organization and abstract thought. The oldest sections date back to nearly 9,000 years ago, far earlier than similar megalithic practices in Europe. Yet unlike Stonehenge or Karnak, the builders of Nubta Playa left no villages, no burials, no artifacts of daily life large enough to form a coherent picture. They appear with patterns of knowledge, then vanish with no clear descendants. How does a culture capable of building astronomical markers disappear so completely that not even a recognizable legacy survives? Some scholars connect Nubta Playa to the early pastoralists of the region, others to Proto-Egyptian groups who later moved toward the Nile. And yet the cultural gap remains unsettling. Egypt's early dynastic symbols, architectural motifs, and cosmological ideas appear fully formed at their earliest point, without obvious transitional phases linking them to these desert astronomers. If there was a bridge between the two cultures, time has not left us its pillars. We see only the beginning of one world and the end of another, with no visible thread binding them. Further west, in the heart of the Sahara, lies an even stranger silence, the traces of what some call the lost cities of the desert. Satellite images reveal circular depressions, geometric shapes, and faint outlines that suggest former settlements or agricultural systems. Some features resemble ancient irrigation networks, others resemble stone foundations hidden beneath sand. Many of these formations remain uninvestigated, inaccessible, or controversial, but their presence hints at a network of communities that once thrived during wetter eras. If these cultures existed, their disappearance was total. They did not migrate into recorded history. They did not merge with known civilizations. They simply stopped leaving traces. The Sahara pump theory offers one explanation. Dramatic shifts in climate every several thousand years transformed the region from green to desert and back again, forcing mass migrations or extinctions. It is plausible, even likely, that entire cultures were wiped out or displaced during these transitions. Yet the abruptness with which some disappear, and the sophistication of what they left behind, leaves room for uneasy speculation. How many societies were swallowed whole by shifting dunes? How many stories lie beneath layers too deep for modern excavation? And could the origins of later civilizations have drawn from these lost desert peoples in ways that archaeological evidence has not yet revealed? North Africa is not alone in this pattern. Arabia too tells a quiet story of vanished cultures. The Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, holds fossils of rivers and lakes from times when humans could have lived comfortably there. Carved petroglyphs scatter across its edges, depicting animals that no longer inhabit the peninsula. Some inscriptions appear in scripts that defy easy categorization. Early, experimental, or transitional forms of writing that hint at literacy older than mainstream models suggest. Yet for all these signs, no major ancient cities have been uncovered in the heart of the sands. Did settlements once stand there, later erased by shifting dunes? Or were these nomadic groups guardians of knowledge that never took the form of permanent architecture? Further east, the deserts of Central Asia carry similar mysteries. The ruins of ancient oases appear abruptly in the archaeological record, sometimes with sophisticated irrigation systems. The so-called Bactria Margiana archaeological complex to Spimak emerges suddenly around the 2nd millennium BCE, then fades almost as abruptly. Its people traded widely, crafted elegant metal work, practiced ritual traditions still debated today. Yet their origins remain obscure. Their scripts are undeciphered. Their first appearance looks too polished to be the beginning of anything. Across these vast dry lands a recurring motif emerges, civilizations that seem to arrive already fluent, already formed, as if memory traveled ahead of them, all the evidence of their past dissolved into sand. There is something disquieting about cultures that leave behind their monuments but not themselves. The desert does not gently preserve. It strips, it moves, it swallows. What survives is often accidental. A stone circle here, a burial mound there, a scattering of petroglyphs hinting at ritual, movement, fear, and hope. And the silence woven between these fragments becomes its own kind of evidence. Evidence of what? Perhaps only that the desert remembers where our histories forget. Even the Sahara's rock art adds to this tension. Thousands of images depict hunters, cattle, mysterious figures with masks or towering headpieces, and animals long extinct in the region. Some scenes imply ritual, others imply contact or conflict. Yet the transition between artistic phases is unclear, and the cultures responsible for them are unnamed. Were these successive waves of unrelated peoples, or the evolution of a single deep-rooted group? Without settlements, without texts, without clear continuity, interpretation becomes speculative, a negotiation between imagination and eroded truth. And beneath all this hovers a quiet possibility. That the desert did not merely erase civilizations, but also conceal their beginnings. If early cultures emerged along lake shores, riverbanks, or coastal plains now lost beneath dunes, then the story we inherited is only the story of the survivors, not the innovators who may have paved the way. When we look across these ancient deserts, the question that rises is not simply what vanished, but what was never allowed to reappear. What knowledge, routines, maps, and cosmologies dissolved alongside the settlements that once held them, And if so much can disappear without a trace, how much of our own understanding rests on the thin surface of what the desert chose not to hide? Somewhere beneath the sand, perhaps, lie the first drafts of civilization, drafts the wind has chosen to keep unread. There are ruins in the world that speak loudly even in their silence, and among them, the cities of the Indus Valley whisper with a peculiar tension. A tension born not from what was found, but from what should have been found and isn't. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro rise from the dust of present-day Pakistan like unfinished sentences, vast and orderly, precise and deliberate, yet strangely detached from the narrative threads that normally bind a civilization to its origins. They exist as if arriving mid-story, without a clear beginning, without an ending anyone has been able to interpret, and without a voice to explain themselves. What unsettles researchers most is not merely the disappearance of the Indus people, but the elegance of what they built before they vanished. Cities laid out in grid systems more sophisticated than many later empires, drainage systems engineered so effectively that some modern planners marvel at their efficiency, standardized bricks across hundreds of sites, suggesting centralized regulation, or shared cultural memory that extended across a region larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. A civilization so vast, so consistent, so meticulously organized, and yet without the palaces, the temples, the royal tombs, or the triumphalist inscriptions that define the personalities of other early cultures. And then there is their script, the greatest silence of all, carved into steer-tight seals, etched into pottery, painted on small tokens. It remains unreadable despite decades of effort. Because it is undeciphered, the Indus world cannot speak for itself. We cannot know its myths, its laws, its fears, its cosmology, its origins, or its reasons for disappearing. Scholars debate whether the script even represents a full language or something more symbolic, a shorthand never intended to narrate. Whatever the truth, the effect is the same: an entire civilization with its mouth sewn shut by time. Mohenjo-Daro, perhaps the most famous of its cities, carries an eerie calm. Its streets follow carefully planned routes. Its buildings rarely rise high, yet they follow patterns suggesting a communal ethic rather than hierarchical rule. There is no clear evidence of kings, no grand tombs, no ostentatious symbols of power. Instead, there are wells, hundreds of them, scattered throughout the city, as if water, not monarchy, was the heart of their world. The so-called Great Bath hints at ritual or communal cleansing, but without texts, its meaning remains suspended in speculation. But beneath the symmetry lies a mystery. These cities show an astonishing level of urban maturity at their earliest levels. Like Çatalhöyük or Karal, they do not appear to grow slowly from humble villages, they appear fully grown. The earliest layers of Harappa already show standardized architecture. The earliest layers of Mohenjo-Daro show drainage systems advanced enough to rival Roman engineering millennia later. Where then are the proto-cities that should precede them? Where are the messy experiments, the gradual learning curves, the imperfect prototypes that normally mark the early steps of civilization? Archaeology answers only with empty soil. Some theories propose precursor cultures in the Gagga-Hakra River region, associated with the legendary Sarasvati River. But even these possibilities raise more questions. If the early Indus people migrated from a drying Sarasvati, why do their earliest known cities still appear so sophisticated? Where is the evidence of their transition from mobile groups to urban societies? Why does their story begin at its peak, as if we are reading a chapter without its introduction? This feeling deepens when considering the sheer scale of their territory. The Indus civilization stretched over 1 million square kilometers, with more than 1,000 known sites. Yet across this enormous expanse, there is a strange uniformity. In their weights and measures, their artistic motifs, their building methods. This suggests communication, shared governance, or cultural cohesion, of a kind difficult to reconcile with the absence of royal monuments or centralized power structures. A civilization so large, so connected, yet so invisible in its hierarchy. And then, after flourishing for centuries, it fades, not with fire, not with conquest, not with a single catastrophic collapse. It dissolves, slowly, quietly, almost politely. Around 1900 BCE, the great cities begin to empty. Populations move eastward, towards smaller rural settlements. Urban planning declines. Brick production becomes inconsistent. Trade networks fray. The script disappears, the seals stop being carved, and the lights, metaphorically speaking, go out. Why? Climate change is one explanation. Shifts in monsoon patterns and the possible drying of the Sarasvati River could have strained agriculture. Some researchers point to tectonic activity altering water sources. Others mention disease or changing trade routes, or internal social transformation. All reasonable possibilities, yet none fully account for the magnitude of the disappearance, a civilization of millions evaporating so thoroughly that even their language left no surviving descendants. But the most haunting element lies in how little they seem to struggle. There is no widespread evidence of warfare, no burnt layers indicating violent destruction, no mass graves tied to conflict. If they fell softly. And nothing is more mysterious than a civilization that dies quietly. The undeciphered script remains the center of gravity around which all these uncertainties orbit. Without it, the Indus world is a map without labels, a melody without lyrics, and its silence has inspired interpretations ranging from cautious to bold. Some propose that the Indus script could be an ancestor to Dravidian languages. Others argue for entirely different linguistic families. A few speculate that the script represents ritual or administrative systems unrelated to spoken language. And then there are the more daring theories, suggesting lost traditions, lost cultural spheres, or even lost civilizations preceding the Indus that shaped its knowledge. These ideas are not proof of anything, but they echo a pattern witnessed across the ancient world. The appearance of complexity without clear lineage, Harappa's precision, Mohenjo-Daro's planning, Dholavir's water management, the Lothal dockyard, possibly one of the oldest known seaports. Each site introduces mastery rather than progression, and mastery without ancestry always unsettles. One detail often overlooked deepens the unease. The Indus civilization's iconography includes motifs seen in far older or geographically distant contexts. The tree of life, horned figures, meditative postures, animals arranged in symbolic pairs. These may be coincidental or universal expressions of human imagination. But sometimes similarities stir a faint suspicion. Could shared memory extend beyond geographical boundaries and beyond the eras we comfortably map? What is most striking is how the Indus world resists narrative. Every civilization we know tells a story through its ruins. Egypt speaks of kings and gods. Mesopotamia recounts floods and tyrants. Greece sings of heroes. Rome proclaims order and empire. But the Indus Valley speaks only through patterns, through its bricks, drains, weights, and seals. And patterns are notoriously difficult to interpret without context. Perhaps that is why its disappearance feels more like a curtain than a collapse. A curtain drawn not to end a play, but to hide an earlier one the world has somehow forgotten. When we look at these ancient cities and their unreadable script, we find ourselves confronting not merely a vanished people, but a vanished coherence. A story whose middle is intact but whose beginning and end have been swallowed by time. And in the softest, quietest moments, a question rises from that disappearance. How much of humanity's early history stands before us like the Indus script, complete in form, but unreadable in truth? There are edges of the world where the land seems to remember a time before memory itself, and those edges are almost always traced by water. Long before maps, long before kingdoms, long before anyone carved stories into clay or stone, the oceans were the first roads. Vast, shifting corridors that shaped the movement of early peoples, And if there is a category of ancient civilization most vulnerable to disappearance, it is the kind that lived beside these borders, building their homes on coastlines destined to drown when ice melted, and the seas rose like a slow, relentless tide. What remains today are faint sketches, submerged harbors, scattered legends, and questions that refuse to fade. The end of the last ice age was not a quiet event. Between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, oceans rose more than 120 meters, swallowing entire continents of coastal plains. These were not small losses. Doggerland in northern Europe, once a landscape of hills, rivers, forests, and settlements, is now the bottom of the North Sea. Sunderland in Southeast Asia, which may have hosted tens of thousands of inhabitants, now lies beneath the water surrounding modern Indonesia. Along nearly every continental shelf, sonar surveys have identified anomalous structures, patterns, and symmetries that hint at former habitation. Yet official archaeology touches these submerged worlds cautiously, hesitantly, almost reluctantly. Excavation beneath water is slow, expensive, and difficult. But perhaps the deeper reluctance lies in the implications. If coastal civilizations existed before the floodwaters rose, then the earliest chapters of human urbanization might be underwater, not lost, but simply out of reach. Off the coast of Japan lies one of the most debated examples, the Yonaguni Monument. Discovered in 1986, it resembles terraces, steps, and platforms carved into rock, arranged with a precision that feels unnatural. Some geologists argue it is a natural formation shaped by tectonic fractures. Others insist parts of it show deliberate modification, straight edges too perfect to dismiss, carvings too distinct to ignore. Whether natural or engineered, its existence opens an uncomfortable door. If people lived along these shores more than 10,000 years ago, where are the rest of their structures now resting? If this was a community, a ritual site, a harbor, or a fortress, then it belonged to a world that no longer exists. Further west in the Mediterranean, other drowned cities lying clear of view. Pavlopetri in Greece, dated to nearly 5,000 years ago, is the oldest known underwater town. Streets, buildings, courtyards, and pottery remain preserved beneath several meters of water, a frozen moment of urban life caught in suspension. Egypt's Heracleion, once a thriving port at the mouth of the Nile, now rests under the sea as well, its colossal statues and temples hauntingly intact. Yet these cities sank in recorded history, as stories preserved in texts or oral tradition. The deeper question concerns the ones that left no such record, the civilizations whose names never reached us, whose languages vanished before they ever became script. Along India's Gulf of Khambhat, sonar surveys at the turn of the 21st century detected linear structures, geometric patterns, and large blocks that some interpreted as architecture tens of thousands of years old. Though the claim remains controversial, skeptics argue the data is inconclusive, the artifacts mixed with natural debris. Supporters insist the sediment patterns point towards submersion during the Ice Age, not later. Regardless of the debate, the underlying challenge persists. Any civilization built along the coastline before 6000 BCE has likely been erased by rising seas, its artifacts scattered or buried beneath layers of silt unreachable, without major technological leaps. And then there are the legends, those peculiar echoes of drowned worlds that surface in myths, from cultures separated by oceans yet curiously synchronized in theme. Plato's Atlantis is the most famous in the Western world, a story of a powerful maritime people who disappeared beneath the waves. But similar tales appear globally. Indigenous Australians speak of land swallowed by the sea and describe former shorelines that modern oceanography later confirmed. In Southeast Asia, stories tell of kingdoms lost beneath the water separating island chains. Pacific Islanders preserve oral traditions of migration routes that now lie deep underwater. Even ancient Tamil literature references a lost land called Kumari Kundam. a continent supposedly submerged long before recorded history. Myths are not evidence, but they are not meaningless either. Often they preserve memories of events too vast for individuals to fully narrate, fragments of trauma stored in story form. When combined with archaeological anomalies, they create a resonance, not a solution, but a direction. A quiet suggestion that something older than we have acknowledged once existed at the edges of the sea. One of the most perplexing puzzles lies in early seafaring technology. Humans reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago, implying mastery of open water navigation far earlier than once believed. The Lapita people crossed thousands of kilometers of the Pacific, using a sophisticated knowledge of stars, waves, and wind, knowledge that did not appear suddenly. Polynesian navigators memorized maps made not of ink but rhythm, memory, and sky. Such traditions hint at a deep maritime lineage, possibly stretching back to pre-Neolithic horizons. Yet the archaeological record of early boats, harbors, or maritime settlements is nearly non-existent before 5000 BCE. Why? Because almost every potential site now lies underwater. What little has survived often appears abruptly, like the Lothal dockyard in the Indus Valley, one of the earliest known examples of a sophisticated port. Its calibrated basins, spillway, and loading platforms suggest a thriving trade network stretching across long distances. But again, its early sophistication raises the same question. Where were the prototypes, the crude early harbors, the experimental attempts before this? Lost, perhaps, along shores we can no longer touch. Even in the Americas, evidence points to coastal migration routes during the Ice Age, routes that are now underwater. The earliest settlers of North America may have followed kelp forests along the Pacific Rim, but the archaeological remnants of their journey are buried beneath hundreds of meters of ocean. If these migrants carried maritime traditions, they may have belonged to cultures already adapted to coastal life, cultures we know nothing about. Across the world, the sea has acted as both creator and destroyer of civilizations. It nourished early communities, offered trade routes, and shaped identity. Yet it also erased their footsteps with equal efficiency. As glaciers melted, they did not simply flood landscapes, they redefined memory. Entire societies may have been wiped from history not through catastrophe but through quiet submersion. And what the sea takes, it rarely returns. When we imagine these lost mariners, people who may have mapped stars long before writing, who understood tides long before mathematics, who built settlements along coastlines now drowned, we confront a strange possibility that some of the earliest civilizations were never meant to be found again. Their stories remain scattered across fragments of seabed, drifting between myth and silt. And so, a question settles at the edge of thought, like a lighthouse glimpsed through fog. If the sea has already buried entire chapters of our past, how many more lie waiting in the depths, unseen, unheard, and perhaps unknowable? Some ruins feel like memories of forgotten hands, as though the stones themselves remember builders whose names dissolved long before written time. They rise from mountains, cling to cliffs, stretch across plains, and yet none of them speak clearly enough to reveal who shaped them. They belong to no recorded kingdom, no confirmed dynasty, no undisputed lineage. Instead, they stand quietly, like unanswered questions carved into the earth. And among all the mysteries of vanished civilizations, few are as haunting as the structures whose creators remain anonymous, the monuments without authors. Across continents, these sites share a peculiar signature: engineering brilliance without accompanying identity. The stones fit too well, the alignments too precise, the choices too deliberate. And yet, the cultural fingerprints we would expect, inscriptions, transitional styles, evolving architectural experiments, are either absent or so faint that they dissolve upon examination. This absence is not merely a lack of information, It is a pattern suggesting that some of history's greatest builders left only their work behind, not their names. In the distant Peruvian highlands, the walls of Sacsayhuaman rise with a confidence that resists explanation. Each stone, some weighing more than 100 tons, interlocks with such accuracy that even a blade of grass cannot slip between them. Mainstream archaeology attributes parts of the structure to the Inca, yet the Inca themselves spoke of earlier builders, a people they referred to as the Huari, or sometimes ancestors whose names had already faded by their own era. The lower, larger stones at many Andean sites reveal a style distinct from later additions: Cyclopean polygonal masonry, executed with techniques that no surviving tradition fully explains. If these were indeed inherited structures, then who built the original foundations? The same riddle appears in far-off Malta, where the megalithic temples of Gantia and Haga Kim rise from the ground with an elegance older than the pyramids. Their curves, altars, figurines, and astronomical alignments suggest an island culture deeply invested in ritual and cosmology. Yet these temples appear suddenly around 3600 BCE, with no clear precursors, no gradual evolution of style, no earlier prototypes, a complete architectural language arriving in its final form and disappearing just as abruptly several centuries later. Like a breath held too long, then released into obscurity. And then there is Corral in Peru's Soup Valley, the oldest known city in the Americas. It too presents a beginning without a beginning. Its pyramids rise with geometric precision. Its sunken circular plazas define a mastery of spatial design. But the earliest layers of Corral do not show a messy transition from simple villages. Instead, they reveal immediate complexity: planned avenues, communal structures, ritual spaces, and instruments like flutes made from condor and pelican bones. Yet Corral's creators left no writing, no artwork explaining their worldview, no royal tombs proclaiming their power, a planned city without a story. A civilization whose silence speaks louder than its ruins. Elsewhere, the anonymity deepens. On Easter Island, the Moai statues stand as watchful guardians of a story that eroded before European arrival. The Rapa Nui oral traditions contain fragments, legends of ancestor figures walking across the land. These accounts drift between myth and metaphor. The quarry at Ranararaku holds nearly 1,000 statues, many unfinished. The scale of labor implies organization, leadership, or ritual obligation. But the written script of the island, Rongorongo, remains undeciphered, leaving the relationship between the builders and their creations shrouded in quiet uncertainty. A whole world view locked behind symbols that refuse to open. Yet perhaps the most enigmatic of all ancient builders are those who shaped the megalithic landscapes of Europe. Stone circles, mounds, avenues, dolmens, and alignments appear across the continent, often with astronomical precision. The builders of Stonehenge, Karnak, Avebury, and Newgrange all seem to have belonged to interconnected cultural networks with shared cosmologies. But these communities left no writing. Their languages are unknown, their political structures invisible. All we have are stones aligned with solstices, equinoxes, lunar cycles, and star paths, arranged by people whose worldviews we can only guess at. If these were isolated curiosities, we might dismiss them as anomalies, but the global pattern is unmistakable. In nearly every region of the world, the earliest monumental architecture appears fully formed, without the visible scaffolding of earlier experiments. It is as if the knowledge to build these structures arrived all at once, not gradually accumulated. And when their cultures vanished, the architectural tradition often vanished with them, leaving behind ruins that later civilizations could admire but not fully replicate. One of the most striking examples lies in Pumapunku near Lake Titicaca. The H-shaped blocks, cut with astonishing symmetry, feature drill holes, right angles, and precision that has provoked debate for decades. Some archaeologists argue the techniques were within the capabilities of pre-Columbian people using stone and bronze tools. Others insist that the complexity suggests lost knowledge or specialized craftsmanship no longer present by the time the Inca encountered the ruins. Regardless of interpretation, the central unease remains. The builders left almost nothing besides the stones themselves. No inscriptions explaining their techniques. No transitional phases showing the evolution of their methods. No cultural remnants robust enough to clarify their identity. Part of the mystery stems from the fact that many later civilizations revered, repurposed, or built atop older structures, blurring the line between generations of builders. The Inca integrated older megalithic foundations. The Egyptians built near earlier structures whose origins have been debated. The Maltese temples were already ancient by the time later islanders arrived. Architecture is inheritance, but without a clear chain of descent. Archaeology offers certain explanations: erosion, looting, organic materials lost to time, disruptions from natural disasters. These are logical possibilities, but logic alone does not resolve the deeper pattern, the appearance of skill without visible ancestry, and the disappearance of that skill without visible decline. It raises a difficult, almost uncomfortable question. Were there civilizations whose knowledge was never meant to survive them? Not through secrecy or conspiracy, but through fragility. The fragility of oral tradition, of specialized crafts passed through memory rather than writing, of worldviews tied to rituals that vanished when societies fractured or migrated. Knowledge that existed vividly for a moment, then faded like a constellation sinking below the horizon. It is possible, too, that the anonymity of these builders reflects a worldview fundamentally different from ours. Perhaps they did not carve their names into stone because they did not value individual legacy. Perhaps the work itself, the alignment with the sky, the integration with the landscape, the ritual purpose, mattered more than the creator. A collective identity, not a personal one. A civilization where memory was preserved in practice, not in inscription. Yet this explanation, poetic as it is, does not fully address the sharpness of the disappearance. The way architectural traditions end suddenly, without clear successors, the way knowledge appears, burns brightly, and then goes dark. What were these builders trying to express in stone, and why does their message feel unfinished, like a letter missing its final page? As we walk among their ruins, the stones seem to murmur an unsettling possibility, that the story of humanity may not be linear but layered, and that some layers were scraped away so cleanly that only the deepest foundations remain. If these nameless builders once formed civilizations of their own, then what else, buried deeper still, waits for rediscovery? There is a particular kind of silence that feels heavier than the absence of sound. A silence of a civilization whose words have survived, yet whose voice has not. Scripts, carved or inked or incised with patient precision, scattered across tablets, shards, seals, and monuments, remain intact while the languages they record have dissolved into undeciphered symbols. These scripts are not merely puzzles, they are echoes. Echoes of entire cultures whose thoughts, laws, fears, and cosmologies lie frozen just beyond our reach. Standing before them is like standing at the edge of a vast chasm. We can see the other side, but no bridge remains to cross it. Some of the most profound disappearances in human history are not of cities or monuments, but of meaning itself. Across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, there exist writing systems so old, so isolated, or so unusual, that they have resisted every attempt at interpretation. These scripts belong to civilizations that either vanished or transformed so completely that their linguistic legacy broke apart, leaving nothing but shapes and patterns that tease the imagination. Their silence is not merely historical, it is existential. To lose a script is to lose a worldview, a consciousness, a language through which reality was once understood and shaped. Among the earliest and most enigmatic of these is Linear A, the script of the Minoans, a culture that flourished on Crete long before classical Greece, building palaces, conducting trade, and crafting art of remarkable refinement. Linear A survives in inscriptions carved on tablets, jars, and ritual objects. Its symbols are elegant, rhythmic, almost musical. Yet despite decades of effort, it remains unreadable. The script seems related to Linear B, the language of the Mycenaeans, but only structurally. The two languages are unrelated. It is as if the Mycenaeans borrowed someone else's alphabet to write their own tongue, leaving the older Minoan language stranded without descendants. The Minoans themselves disappeared after a series of earthquakes, eruptions, and invasions. Their palaces fell silent, their maritime networks dissolved, their stories evaporated, and Linear A, the last surviving trace of their voice, sits locked in museums like a sealed door. Behind it may lie myths, science, songs, treaties, prayers, but all remain inaccessible. A civilization whose script remains unopened is like a library burned from the inside out. A world away, on Easter Island, another closed door stands, the Rongorongo script. Carved into wooden tablets with flowing, looping glyphs, Rongorongo may represent one of the few independent inventions of writing in human history. Some glyphs resemble people, birds, fish, plants. Others look abstract. The script may encode genealogies, rituals, navigation knowledge, or cosmology. But the people who could read it were gone by the time Europeans arrived. Their society collapsed from ecological pressure, disease, and internal conflict. By the time scholars sought to record the language, the last surviving readers were either deceased or unable to pass down their knowledge. The script remains undeciphered, a final breath of a civilization extinguished before its meaning could be preserved. There is a strange sorrow in looking at these glyphs. They appear alive, animated, as though they once danced in the minds of their writers, and now they are still. Written language normally preserves a voice across time. Rongorongo preserves only the shape of one. But perhaps the most unsettling cases come from even older horizons. In regions stretching from modern Iran to the Zagros Mountains lies the Proto-Elamite script, dating back more than 5,000 years. It appears suddenly in the archaeological record with no clear predecessor. Unlike cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs, which evolved gradually from pictorial forms, Proto-Elamite seems to arrive fully formed. A complex system of signs used for administration, ritual, and record-keeping. And then, within a few centuries, it disappears without a trace, replaced by later Elamite writing that bears little resemblance to the earlier system. Why create a sophisticated script only to abandon it? What happened to the people who wrote these tablets? Did they migrate, assimilate, collapse, or did their world simply shift abruptly, leaving their attempt at writing as an isolated experiment? The same perplexity surrounds the Indus script, encountered earlier in the ruins of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Hundreds of symbols arranged in repeated sequences appear on seals, pottery, amulets. Some researchers suggest it may represent Proto-Dravidian. Others believe it encodes symbolic or administrative data rather than language. Some think it may be a logosyllabic system. Still others argue it is too short to constitute writing at all. Every theory seems plausible, none can be proven. The Indus script remains a sealed container, and with it the entire inner life of one of the world's earliest civilizations remains sealed as well. There is an eerie pattern in all these undeciphered systems. The silence of the script often coincides with the disappearance of the people. This raises the question, did the collapse of these civilizations cause the loss of their languages, or did the loss of linguistic continuity contribute to the collapse? Language is a vessel. When a vessel breaks, the worldview it contains spills out. What if some of these cultures depended on oral transmission so deeply that once disrupted, their world could not hold itself together? Even outside these major cases, the world holds countless smaller linguistic ghosts. The Vinca symbols of southeastern Europe, a set of markings found on pottery older than any known writing system, They represent proto-writing or ritual symbols. The Phaistes disc, a single artifact from Crete, contains symbols found nowhere else, its meaning suspended forever in circular text. The Byblos syllabary, discovered in Lebanon, hints at an early attempt at alphabetic writing that vanished before it could influence later scripts. And then there are other languages known only by fragments: Etruscan, Tartessian, Iberian, partially readable, but only in form, not meaning. We can pronounce them, but we cannot understand them. They're like songs whose melodies survive while the lyrics are lost. What connects all these silences is not simply time or erosion, but interruption. Each script represents a worldview cut abruptly, cut by disaster, migration, invasion, cultural assimilation, or internal collapse. When a civilization vanishes, its structures may fall, its bones may rot, but its language, its consciousness, can disappear in an instant if the chain of transmission breaks. And perhaps this is what makes undeciphered scripts so haunting. They remind us that much of human history is already gone. Not just materially, but intellectually. Entire ways of thinking have vanished. Entire cosmologies, entire systems of meaning. Our species carries a deep amnesia, one we rarely notice because the surviving voices speak loudest. But the undeciphered ones press quietly against the edges of our awareness, whispering a possibility both humbling and unsettling. What if the greatest stories of early humanity were never written in books, but on tablets, seals, and wooden boards that we can still see, but no longer read? These scripts are not simply lost languages, they are lost mirrors, and without them, we see only fragments of ourselves reflected through the narrow lens of what survived. Somewhere inside these silent symbols, the ghosts of vanished civilizations wait. And the question that lingers, soft but insistent, is this: if their words remain unread, how much of their world remains completely unseen? There's a strange feeling that comes over anyone who looks at the ocean long enough, a sense that something enormous lies beneath, not just physically, but historically. Water hides things in a way earth never can. Soil preserves bones, buries pottery, shelters inscriptions. But water swallows, it erases, it folds entire worlds into silence. And so when ancient cities vanish beneath the sea, it is not merely destruction, but a kind of oblivion. A disappearance so absolute that even their memory seems reluctant to resurface. Humanity evolved beside water, followed water, built its earliest settlements along coastlines, harbors, river mouths, and sheltered lagoons. Yet those landscapes were never permanent. When the last ice age ended, sea levels rose with a slowness that was devastating precisely because it did not stop. Coastlines retreated year after year, century after century. Villages abandoned, fields drowned, rituals displaced. And somewhere in that long drowning, entire civilizations slipped beneath the waves, leaving only fragments for us to piece together thousands of years later. The remains of these submerged worlds exist everywhere, not as cohesive cities, but as hints, as ruins glimpsed through murky water, as stones worn smooth by tide, as sonar echoes revealing right angles where none should be. Each carries a whisper of a world before ours, yet none speak clearly enough to give a certainty. Among the most striking is Petri, lying just off the coast of southern Greece. Its streets, buildings, and courtyards remain frozen in place, preserved under only a few meters of water. Dated to around 2800 BCE, it is the oldest known underwater town. But what haunts archaeologists is not its age, but its sophistication, the clear urban layout, the evidence of trade, the fading traces of rituals performed near the sea. Petri did not fall to catastrophe. It was taken gradually by rising tides. Its people likely watched the shoreline creep toward them across generations, until one day their homes slipped beyond reach. They moved inland, and the city remained behind, slowly dissolving into the Aegean. This quiet submersion echoes across the ancient Mediterranean, where countless coastal settlements have left only submerged pottery or collapsed walls as their gravestone. Far more dramatic is the case of Heracleion and Canopus, ancient Egyptian port cities near the mouth of the Nile, once bustling centers of commerce, temples, and political power. They collapsed in a series of earthquakes, soil liquefaction events, and rising waters around the 2nd century BCE. When divers rediscovered them, colossal statues lay toppled on the seabed, coins shimmered in the silt, and the remains of a sacred barge rested silently among broken pillars. These cities were not myth, they were simply forgotten. The disappearance was recorded only in vague echoes in ancient texts, until the sea returned them to our awareness centuries later. If this happened in the Hellenistic world, well within recorded history, what might have happened in the thousands of years before writing emerged? In India's Gulf of Kambab, sonar images from the early 2000s revealed geometrical patterns that some have interpreted as ancient structures, possibly predating known civilizations. The claim remains deeply debated. Skeptics demand clearer evidence. Supporters argue the sedimentary layers suggest great antiquity. The controversy reveals less about the site itself than about our discomfort with the idea that complex societies might have flourished before the dates we accept. If the sea swallowed them long before writing, how would we ever know? Even more enigmatic is Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan. A stepped pyramid-like formation, terraces and flat surfaces appear beneath the water. Geological or artificial? The debate continues, yet the shapes remain compelling. If ancient people lived there when sea levels were lower, 10,000 or 12,000 years ago, then any settlements they built were lost when the waters rose. Whether Yonaguni is a natural formation shaped by human hands or a completely natural structure, its existence forces us to confront the staggering scale of landscapes hidden below. But perhaps no region illustrates the silence of drowned civilizations better than Doggerland, the vast stretch of land that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. 10,000 years ago, Doggerland was a place of forests, rivers, animals, and likely human communities. Then the sea rose, and the world shrank. Today, only fishermen's nets occasionally pull up tools, bones, or fragments of hearths, objects from a disappeared landscape. No monuments, no scripts, no temples. A world erased not violently, but patiently. The same story repeats in Southeast Asia, where Sundaland once stretched across what is now Indonesia, Malaysia, and surrounding regions. During the Ice Age, Sundaland formed one continuous landmass, likely home to early populations who adapted to coastal life. Many researchers believe myths of drowned kingdoms across Indonesia, Malaysia, and Polynesia may preserve memories of this ancient world. It is possible that early maritime cultures, long before what we call civilization, developed along these vanished coasts. Their rituals, their settlements, their stories now lie below tens of meters of ocean. In the Pacific, countless island cultures hold memories of lands that no longer exist. Oral traditions describe places swallowed by the sea, ancestors migrating when waves consumed their homes, stones marking where shorelines used to stand. These memories, often dismissed as fiction, align eerily with geological evidence showing dramatic sea level shifts. Myth, in this context, is not literal history, but it may carry emotional truths about real catastrophes. And then there is Atlantis, not as a literal city of impossible technology, but as a philosophical metaphor that Plato may have based on older tales of real lost cultures. The idea of a powerful maritime society destroyed by water is not unique to Greece, it is global. The narrative resonates because it echoes something deep in human memory: the fear of losing everything to the sea. Modern archaeology tends to separate myth from evidence, but the drowned landscapes of the world blur that distinction. When we dive into the ruins of Heracleion or Pavla Petri, or scan the ocean floor near Japan or India, We are not simply exploring ancient cities, we are exploring the boundaries of what can be remembered at all. The most troubling truth is that underwater civilizations leave almost no archaeological footprint beyond stone. Wood decays, cloth disappears, metal corrodes, structures collapse. Entire cultures could have existed in coastal plains now underwater, and the only surviving evidence might lie buried beneath layers of sediment we have not yet reached. How many are there? How large were they? How far did their trade networks extend? Did they build monuments now lost forever? We may never know, because the sea has no interest in preserving our curiosity. Yet one cannot help but wonder, if a civilization rises near water, knowing that water gives and water takes, do its people intuitively understand that their legacy will be fragile? Did they build knowing their works might drown one day? Did they leave warnings we cannot read? Did they whisper stories about falling coastlines, shifting currents, or rising tides long before the final waves reach their homes? The ocean has always been a storyteller of inertia, and somewhere in its depths, among ruins that light barely touches, lie forgotten narratives of cultures that lived and died at the edge of the world. Their names are gone, their language is gone, their myths, rituals, and philosophies dissolved into salt. The question that lingers is simple, yet immense. If these civilizations vanished beneath the sea without a trace, how many more lie beyond our imagination, waiting in the deep? Some losses in history feel accidental, the work of erosion, fire, shifting rivers, rising seas. But there is another kind of disappearance, one more deliberate, more unsettling, as if a civilization made the choice to erase itself or to hide what it had seen. When evidence of such choices surfaces, it brings a different texture to the past, not the quiet fading of a culture, but an intentional burial, an act of concealment carried out by human hands. And in those rare cases, the mystery deepens, because what kind of society chooses to bury its own memory? The most haunting example is Göbekli Tepe, the archaeological enigma whose pillars rise like frozen thoughts from a world that should not have existed. Dating back more than 11,000 years, the site predates agriculture, pottery, metallurgy, cities, everything we associate with organized societies, and yet its megalithic enclosures display a mastery of symbolic art, architectural planning, and ritual intent. But what unsettles researchers more than its age is its ending. Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned. It was buried. Layer after layer of earth was poured into the site, packing the enclosures so tightly that the pillars stood upright long after the people who raised them were gone. This was not a collapse or natural disaster. It was an intentional act, carried out slowly, carefully, as though the builders decided the monument should not be destroyed but instead entombed. Why? To protect it? To seal a ritual cycle? To bury a worldview that no longer fit the changing world? Or to prevent later generations from understanding something they believe should remain hidden? Archaeologists avoid speculation, but the question persists like a quiet pulse beneath the soil. Who buries their own sacred structures unless they feel what they contain? Göbekli Tepe is not alone in this pattern of deliberate burial or ritual erasure. At Cheonu, not far from Göbekli Tepe, excavations revealed repeated architectural transformations in a single ritual building. Floors made of stone, then clay, then pebbles, repeatedly rebuilt as if each generation modified a practice inherited from the last. Beneath one floor, archaeologists discovered a pit filled with skull fragments, possibly the remains of ritual activities whose meaning has been lost. Then, suddenly, the pattern ends. The site is transformed, then abandoned. A profound shift occurs, leaving behind no explanation. It is as if a community changed its mind about who they were and what they were doing, or as if they were forced to. Elsewhere in the world, cultures confronted with existential threats sometimes bury, burn, or intentionally destroy their own knowledge. When Spanish forces conquered the Inca Empire, many surviving Andean communities burned their quipas, the knotted cords used for record-keeping and possibly more. They feared the cord records would be used against them, but they also believed that some quipas contained sacred information not meant for foreign eyes. The result is a hole in Andean memory, a lacuna created not by time but by conscious choice. In Central America, Maya scribes sometimes erased or overwrote earlier texts, modifying histories to fit changing political narratives. In Mesopotamia, kings would chisel away the inscriptions of earlier rulers, rewriting stories to claim continuity or divine legitimacy. These acts of erasure were political, strategic, but others seem more philosophical or spiritual, driven by belief, ritual transformation, or fear of what knowledge could do. This raises a troubling possibility. Could some ancient civilizations have intentionally erased themselves because they believed survival required forgetting? Certain anthropological studies suggest that when societies undergo extreme stress, ecological, political, or spiritual, they sometimes abandon or invert their traditions. Ritual centers lose meaning. Symbols change. Practices once sacred become taboo. When this happens at scale, the culture can collapse not through warfare or famine, but through ideological implosion. But what if such implosion was sometimes orchestrated? Consider cultures where initiation rites restrict knowledge to a small portion of the community. If those initiates vanish due to disaster or conflict, the knowledge chain breaks instantly. The society may choose to bury the remnants, physically or metaphorically, to avoid confusion or conflict. What we interpret as collapse might in some cases be a controlled dismantling of tradition. Göbekli Tepe stands as the clearest physical evidence of this phenomenon. To bury such massive structures required immense coordination. A community gathered not to build, but to conceal. The burial preserved the site for millennia but destroyed its living function. The symbolic world that once animated the pillars became inert, sealed beneath layers of earth. And then a profound transformation occurred in the region. Agriculture emerged. It is not unreasonable to ask whether these events were connected. Did the burial of Göbekli Tepe mark the end of a ritual world and the beginning of a practical one? A shift from hunter-gatherer cosmology to agricultural hierarchy? From shared identity to settled belonging? If so, then Göbekli Tepe's burial might have been a cultural boundary, a symbolic death that allowed a different form of society to arise. But there is another interpretation, quieter and more difficult to confront, that a group deliberately hid their knowledge because they sensed something changing, climate, environment, cosmology, and believed their worldview could not survive in the new conditions. Human history contains moments where knowledge becomes dangerous, where symbols lose meaning, where ancient cosmologies become burdens rather than guides. When that happens, communities sometimes choose silence. This pattern appears again in later eras. The Olmecs produced colossal stone heads, intricate motifs, and early script-like symbols. Then their culture dissolved, leaving its iconography scattered across the region. Later civilizations admired their works, but did not fully inherit their worldview. Something was lost between generations, something fundamental enough that it could not be transmitted. In the Near East, the Hittites vanished from the historical record for centuries, leaving behind ruins but not stories. Their political collapse was real, but their disappearance was amplified by the interruption of textual transmission. Their knowledge survived briefly in fragmented cuneiform tablets, but the voices behind the tablets faded almost instant. Across Europe, the builders of the megalithic tradition, Stonehenge, Karnak, Avebury, left no written explanation of their purpose. When their world changed, the monuments remained, but their meanings evaporated. In Japan, the Jomon culture created some of the oldest pottery in the world and maintained a continuous artistic tradition for thousands of years. But when new populations arrived, much of that symbolic world was absorbed, diluted, or abandoned. No texts explain why. These are not isolated events. They are a quiet thread woven across continents. Sometimes civilizations do not vanish. They are buried by strangers, by descendants, or by themselves. And each act of burial, whether physical or ideological, suggests a moment when a culture reached a threshold it could not cross without leaving something behind. When we look at sites like Göbekli Tepe, Çayörnu, or other ritual centers that were sealed rather than simply abandoned, we confront a strange possibility. That humanity's early story includes deliberate erasures, choices made not in desperation, but in intention. The open question that rises from these buried worlds is not just what was hidden, but why it was hidden. And if knowledge could be buried once, how many other silences in history might not be accidents, but decisions? In the far northern reaches of the world, where daylight stretches thin and winter seems to swallow the calendar whole, history behaves differently. It does not reveal itself in tidy layers of sediment or in the tidy ruins of sun-baked plains. Instead, it hides beneath ice, beneath tundra, beneath forests older than any written chronicle. Cold is an archivist without mercy. It preserves and destroys in equal measure. And in these quiet, frozen margins, some of humanity's most elusive civilizations flicker like auroras, sudden, haunting, impossible to grasp for more than a moment before they fade back into obscurity. Here, disappearance takes on a different form. It is not the dramatic vanishing of a city swallowed by the sea or consumed by flame. It is the slow erasure of cultures that lived where the world itself refuses to hold memories for long. Archaeology struggles in the Arctic not because nothing happened there, but because everything decays too quickly or freezes too deeply. Sites lie buried under meters of permafrost. Bones shatter when unearthed. Organic materials vanish into acidic soils. And so northern civilizations often come to us as fragments, glimpses too incomplete to form a full picture. Yet these fragments hint at stories far richer than we once believed. One of the earliest is found at Yana RHS, a Pleistocene site in northeastern Siberia, where humans lived more than 30,000 years ago, far earlier than scholars expected people to survive in such extreme cold. Burins, beads, ivory tools, and hunting equipment emerge from the permafrost, each artifact a quiet defiance of the assumption that the North was inhospitable. These people did not merely pass through, they thrived. And then, as abruptly as they appeared, they vanished, leaving no clear descendants and no tradition preserved beyond a scatter of tools. Other sites across Siberia tell similar stories. The Upper Paleolithic cultures along the Lena and Yenisei rivers created carvings, ornaments, and symbolic figures, only to disappear with the shifting climate that followed. Some may have migrated. Others may have merged with later populations. But the archaeological record breaks like thin ice, failing to bridge one cultural phase to the next. Instead, we confront standalone worlds, brilliant and brief. Moving westward, the mystery deepens in the northern forests of Finland, Norway, and Russia, lands once inhabited by ancient groups whose identities now blur between archaeology and legend. The Sami people, one of Europe's oldest continuous cultures, preserve fragments of older traditions, shamanic drums, star lore, memories of migrations that predate written history, but even they speak of earlier inhabitants, the Siedi builders, the Starlu, or mythical giants associated with ancient stone structures scattered across the region. Scholars interpret these as mythological memories of lost peoples who lived in the Arctic long before the Sami arrived. Their artifacts remain rare, the settlements nearly invisible, their disappearance profound. Then there are the Karelians, Kargopol peoples, and ancient forest cultures whose petroglyphs, deer, boats, spirals, rituals, appear on granite cliffs beside frozen lakes. The carvings date back thousands of years, Yet the people who made them left no written language, no continuity, no unmistakable cultural fingerprint. The petroglyphs stand as memorials without names. Their creators existed, distinct and vibrant, but the cold consumed most traces of their lives. Farther east, the Okunev culture of southern Siberia left behind haunting stone stelae, carved with faces both human and otherworldly. The iconography is unlike any neighboring culture. Solar symbols, horned beings, geometric patterns, animal spirits. Their burial sites suggest complex rituals, yet they left no writing and maintained no long-lasting material legacy. They appeared around the early Bronze Age, flourished briefly, then dissolved, absorbed or replaced by later steppe cultures whose languages and traditions overwhelm their traces. The Okunev world survives only through stone expressions of beliefs whose meanings we cannot decode. The Arctic coastlines add yet another layer to this mystery. In northern Alaska and Canada, the Dorset culture, a Paleo-Eskimo people, created intricate carvings of animals, spirits, and human figures. Their art is strikingly different from that of the later Inuit, suggesting a completely separate cultural lineage. Dorset people lived in the frozen north for thousands of years, adapting with remarkable resilience. Yet they disappeared abruptly about 700 years ago. The Inuit who replaced them described the Dorset as gentle, strong, and possibly possessing abilities they considered extraordinary. But no one knows what caused their disappearance. Climate change, disease, conflict, or isolation. Each explanation feels partial. A civilization deeply adapted to the Arctic simply vanished. In Greenland, the Norse settlements, founded around 985 CE, survived for nearly 5 centuries, farming, trading, and building churches at the edge of an unforgiving landscape. Their disappearance remains equally mysterious. The Norse left behind ruins, middens, and texts, but the exact reason for their decline remains uncertain. Climate cooling, trade collapse, soil erosion, conflict with the Inuit, or a combination of all these, the truth is still debated. The collapse was not sudden, but staggered, a slow fading of light in a place where winter never ends. A deeper mystery lies in the whispers of possible early Arctic peoples whose remains may never have been preserved. Ice melts, permafrost shifts, glacial movements grind bone to dust. If any advanced northern cultures existed tens of thousands of years ago, their traces would be nearly impossible to recover. The silence of the Arctic is not proof of absence. It is simply the nature of cold to hide what it touches. But the North holds more than archaeology. It holds mythic memory. Across northern cultures, legends speak of earlier inhabitants who vanished without a trace. In Siberian shamanic traditions, there are tales of sky beings, under-ice dwellers, and ancient races that moved with the migrations of stars. Norse mythology preserves the idea of previous ages of the world, worlds that ended, worlds forgotten. The Sami speak of beings associated with sacred stones, beings who shaped the land before humans arrived. Inuit traditions describe Teniats people who are real, the Dorset, but also other older beings whose stories blur into something more ancient than archaeology can confirm. These myths are not literal histories, but they often preserve emotional truths, memories of cultural contact, displacement, or inherited belief from peoples long gone. Even genetic studies complicate the narrative. Traces of ancient northern lineages appear in modern populations in ways that do not align neatly with archaeological models. For example, the genetic imprint of the Paleo-Siberian peoples appears in unexpected places, hinting at migrations or cultural interactions barely visible in the physical record. The result is a landscape where history, myth, and silence overlap so tightly that they become inseparable. Perhaps this is the real challenge of the North, not that civilizations disappeared suddenly, but that they disappeared gradually, their memories dissolving into forests, ice, and sky, until only faint shadows remain. There is something poetic in this. A civilization shaped by winter eventually becomes winter, quiet, enduring, hard to decipher. And if the cold north can swallow society so thoroughly that even their languages leave barely a footprint, one unsettling question lingers. How many more civilizations lived and vanished in these frozen horizons without leaving any trace at all? There is a particular kind of disappearance that does not come from nature at all. Not from floods, not from droughts, not from shifting continents or collapsing climates, but from the slow and purposeful hand of empire. Empires do not simply conquer. They overwrite. They impose new calendars, new gods, new architecture, new ways of telling time itself, and sometimes, when they expand far enough or last long enough, they bury entire civilizations without needing to lift a sword. Erasure in these cases is not destruction. It is replacement, a rewriting of memories so complete that the older world dissolves behind the one that takes its place. History is filled with these quiet obliterations. They often survive only in faint, distorted echoes, fragments of customs, unexplained symbols, names that appear once and never again, myths that seem to come from nowhere. They're hints of peoples whose voices were silenced not by catastrophe, but by narrative. The winners carved the inscriptions, the losers faded into the soil. In the ancient Near East, this cycle played out repeatedly. The Hittite Empire, powerful, literate, expansive, dominated Anatolia for centuries, shaping politics from Mesopotamia to the Aegean. Yet after its sudden collapse around 1200 BCE, the Hittites vanished from the historical record. For centuries, their very existence was forgotten. Their name known only through obscure biblical references that scholars considered metaphorical. Their cities lay buried under farmland. Their texts, written in cuneiform, lay unread in museum collections. It was not until the 20th century, after the decipherment of their language, that the Hittites re-emerged from oblivion. A whole civilization lost not to time, but to narrative gaps left by its conquerors. If an empire as vast as the Hittites could be forgotten, what hope do smaller cultures have? Consider the Mitanni, a kingdom that once rivaled Egypt and Babylon. They trained chariot masters, influenced religious traditions, and negotiated treaties with pharaohs. Yet they left behind almost no inscriptions of their own. Most of what we know comes from the archives of their enemies. When their kingdom fell, their identity dissolved. Their language left only a handful of words. Their gods were absorbed by neighbors. Their ruins were swallowed by later settlements. Today, the Mitanni exist not as a remembered people, but as a faint political shadow traced around the margins of surviving texts. Even larger empires participated in this erasure. When the Neo-Assyrian Empire expanded, it deported entire populations, a deliberate strategy to erase local identities and prevent rebellion. These deportations scattered cultures into foreign lands, where their languages and traditions fractured. Many of these groups disappeared from history not because they died, but because their cultural continuity was methodically broken. A similar fate awaited the Elamites, the ancient people of southwestern Iran. For millennia, they maintained their own language, writing system, and religious traditions, interacting with Sumer, Babylon, and Persia. Yet when the Persian Achaemenids rose to power, they absorbed Elamite administration but overshadowed the culture itself. Elamite cities were rebuilt, repurposed, renamed. Their written texts, once vibrant, slowly declined. By the time Alexander the Great marched through the region, Elamite identity had already begun fading into the Persian world. Today, the Elamites survive mostly as footnotes, an entire civilization muted by the expansion of a more dominant narrative. This pattern repeats globally. In Mesoamerica, the Olmecs, often called the mother culture of the region, left behind colossal heads, jade carvings, and symbolic motifs. But when later civilizations emerged, the Maya, the Zapotecs, the Teotihuacanos, they absorbed Olmec influences while overwriting Olmec identity. No texts survive to tell us who the Olmecs thought they were. As centers were abandoned, then repurposed. As symbols reinterpreted. The Olmec world dissolved into the cultural DNA of the societies that followed. They vanished not from catastrophe, but from inheritance. In South America, the Chavin culture, creators of vast temples and intricate iconography, similarly disappeared behind later Andean civilizations. Their artistic style survives in distorted echoes, but their language, names, and internal beliefs vanished beneath the rise of cultures like the Moche and Inca. The Chavin did not fall violently. They simply slipped beneath new religious and political structures. And then there are the civilizations erased through religious conquest. The spread of monotheistic traditions in the ancient world often led to the destruction of earlier temples, shrines, and sacred symbols. But even more damaging was the ideological rewriting that followed. The gods of old pantheons were recast as demons, their rituals condemned, their myths suppressed. This happened in the Levant, in Rome, in Egypt, in Persia, in Northern Europe. Entire cosmologies disappeared not through war but through reinterpretation. One of the most striking examples lies in pre-Christian Europe, where countless local traditions, Celtic, Baltic, Slavic, Germanic, were suppressed as Christianity spread. Much of their oral literature was never recorded. Sacred groves were cut down, temples were replaced with churches, rituals adapted or outlawed. Today, much of what we know comes through the distorted lens of outside observers or later folkloric remnants. These were civilizations of their own, with priests, laws, social structures, astronomies, but they left behind almost nothing except faint echoes. Sometimes the erasure was even more deliberate. When the Roman Empire conquered Carthage, it declared the city must be destroyed from memory. Entire libraries were burned. Carthaginian histories were eradicated. The only surviving narratives about them come from Rome, their enemy. Hannibal, Hamilcar, the Barcids, their voices are known through Roman historians who had no interest in preserving their truth. This is historical disappearance of the most insidious kind. When you control the story, you control what survives. Similex played out in Asia. In China, dynastic transitions often involved burning texts of previous regimes. The Qin dynasty famously buried scholars and destroyed books to unify ideology, an act that created irreparable gaps in early Chinese thought. Later dynasties repeated similar patterns, erasing philosophies, regional traditions, or rival histories that threatened the official narrative. In the Americas, the arrival of Europeans accelerated the erasure of entire worlds. The Maya codices, repositories of astronomy, mythology, medicine, and history, were burned by conquistadors. Only 4 survive. The Inca Quepus, which may have encoded historical and administrative memory, was seized and often destroyed. Aztec temples were razed, their stones reused for colonial cathedrals. These were not passive losses. They were deliberate acts of epistemic control. When a civilization's memory is destroyed, the civilization itself disappears, even if its people survive. And this is perhaps the most unsettling lesson. The destruction of knowledge can erase a culture more effectively than the destruction of bodies, because the people who remain can be absorbed, assimilated, renamed. Their descendants may walk among us, but the world that shaped their ancestors is gone. This raises a question difficult to ignore. How many civilizations vanished, not because they collapsed, but because someone else wrote over them? Empires do not always conquer with swords. Sometimes they conquer with stories. And as we examine the blank spaces in our historical maps, the cultures that flicker once and never again, we're forced to wonder, were these truly lost civilizations? Or were they simply overwritten so thoroughly that all that remains are shadows? There is a quiet, unsettling theme that runs through the earliest chapters of human history. The sense that some civilizations did not simply rise once, flourish, and fall, but that they rose twice, or even more. as if a culture could fracture, dissipate, disappear into silence, and then re-emerge centuries later with echoes of a memory it should not logically still possess. These are the worlds that ended not once but in cycles, where collapse was not a final event but kind of forgetting, followed by a strange return. In archaeology, patterns like these should not exist. Cultural evolution is supposed to unfold gradually, with innovations building on past knowledge in a sequence that can be traced through artifacts and architectural changes. But some ancient societies violate this expectation. They show deep ruptures, gaps where the old world vanishes, only for a new one to appear, bearing uncanny similarities to what came before. It is as though the memory of the first civilization lingers just long enough to shake the second, but not long enough to leave clear evidence in between. One of the most striking examples is the Minoan civilization. Before their world was transformed by the cataclysmic eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE, the Minoans had built extraordinary palaces, Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, with advanced plumbing, vibrant frescoes, and complex administrative systems. After the eruption, many of these centers were devastated, yet within a century the Minoans rebuilt, re-establishing palaces, restoring trade, reasserting their artistic traditions. But the new world was subtly different. Their religious iconography changed. Their administrative script shifted. Their political structures seemed altered. It was a rebirth, but not a continuation. The civilization that emerged after Thera felt like the memory of the one before it, recognizable yet changed, as though the original blueprint had been remade from fragments. Something similar occurred in the Olmec civilization of Mesoamerica. Flourishing around 1200 BCE, the Olmecs created colossal heads, ceremonial centers, and symbolic motifs that influenced later cultures. But around 400 BCE, their major sites were abandoned or destroyed. Scholars debate the cause: environmental stresses, social upheaval, volcanic activity. Yet centuries later, in the early stages of the Maya and other Mesoamerican cultures, Olmec ideas return. The same jaguar motifs, similar cosmological patterns, familiar monumental styles. These echoes suggest a cultural memory that survived the collapse, carried perhaps by migrating peoples or preserved in oral traditions. A civilization ending, then reappearing in new, dispersed forms. Another haunting example lies in the Cycladic Islands, where early Bronze Age populations developed a distinct artistic tradition. Sleek marble figurines, ritual objects, coastal settlements. Their world collapsed around 2000 BCE, likely due to climatic stress or seismic events. For a time, the islands show reduced activity. But then, unexpectedly, new cultural forms emerge, drawing on earlier traditions yet belonging to a new social context. The figurines never return in their original form, but their aesthetic sensibility resurfaces indirectly in later Aegean art. A Cycladic world lived twice, once visibly, once as an influence without name. But perhaps the most dramatic case of cyclical civilization is the story of the Maya. Their classic collapse around the 9th century CE is one of archaeology's most studied mysteries. Great cities, Tikal, Kolpam, Palenque, were abandoned. Dynasties ended. Hieroglyphic writing ceased in many regions. The reasons remain debated. Drought, warfare, political fragmentation, resource exhaustion, disease. Yet the Maya did not disappear. Instead, they moved. Their political structure dissolved, but their cosmology survived in communities that endured and transformed over centuries. When the post-classic period began, new centers such as Chichen Itza and Mayapan rose to prominence, drawing on classic traditions while reshaping them into new identities. A civilization died, then lived again, altered, decentralized, but unmistakably linked to its earlier self. This cyclical phenomenon appears in prehistory as well, though with far less clarity. In the Upper Paleolithic of Europe, bursts of artistic expression. Cave paintings at Chauvet, Altamira, Lascaux appear suddenly, flourish brilliantly, and vanish for long periods before reappearing in new forms. These cycles may reflect cultural fragmentation and reconsolidation, or migrations that carried ideas across landscapes before losing cohesion. Yet the most intriguing examples are those from the dawn of settled society, in regions like Anatolia and the Levant. At sites such as Jericho, Çatalhöyük, and Aşıklıhöyük, there are deep sequences of building, destruction, rebuilding, and reinvention. Houses are rebuilt on old foundations. Ritual practices evolve in sudden steps. Architectural innovations appear, disappear, then re-emerge centuries later in different villages. These repetitions suggest not simple linear evolution, but cultural memory cycling through phases of collapse and renewal. Even in Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization, cycles dominate the record. The Ubaid culture gave way to Uruk, which collapsed, leading to new city-states that borrowed from its legacy. Sumer rose, fell, returned. Akkad rose, fell, and its traditions resurfaced in later empires. Each civilization built on the one before, but not directly. Always with a rupture in between, a dark age, a scattering, a period of silence. Why do these silences exist? Why do cultures seem to lose knowledge, only to rediscover it later? One explanation lies in the fragility of early complexity. When populations decline due to drought, disease, or migration, specialized knowledge can evaporate in a single generation. A master builder dies, a priestly lineage ends, a craft disappears. And when stability returns centuries later, people reinvent older ideas without realizing they are reinventing them. Knowledge can be lost and reborn because humans return instinctively to certain patterns, cosmological, architectural, symbolic. But another explanation, more unsettling, hints at deeper disruption. Some researchers who study collapse patterns note that many ancient societies faced repeated cycles linked to climate oscillations, the 8.2 kilo-year event, the 4.2 kilo-year event, volcanic winters, abrupt shifts in monsoons. These stresses could fracture cultures repeatedly, forcing them into cycles of contraction and expansion. Each time, they would rebuild with some memory of the past, but without its full continuity. It is possible that early humanity lived through more cycles than we realize. Cycles erased not just by time, but by the return of growth that buried the traces of earlier worlds. There is even a hypothesis, debated but persistent, that civilization itself may be older than its oldest known examples, but appears younger because only its final iteration survived intact. If earlier cycles were wiped out almost completely, by shifting seas, by glacial retreats, by desertification, by volcanic events, then each new cycle would appear to modern archaeology as the first. The idea is not that lost high-tech civilizations existed, but that cultural complexity may have risen, collapsed, and risen again long before the earliest monuments we know, each cycle leaving only hints, never intact systems. A final, quieter example illustrates this poignantly: the Andean highlands. For thousands of years, cultures rose and fell: Corral, Chavin, Paracas, Nazca, Wari, Tiwanaku, Inca, each inheriting fragments of cosmology and architecture from the previous. Yet between them lie dark periods where populations shrink, cities empty, and knowledge seems to evaporate. The Andes hold multiple spirals of civilization, each echoing the one before. This cyclical rhythm raises an uncomfortable question. What if much of human history was lived in patterns we've barely begun to understand? Not a line, but a pulse. Not a rise and fall, but many rises and many falls. The civilizations that ended twice, or many times, show us that disappearance is not always permanent. Sometimes it is a pause, a forgetting, a breath drawn in darkness before the world begins again. The question that lingers, soft but insistent, is this: if the past lived more than once, how many cycles existed before the first one we can see? There is a peculiar sensation that creeps in when you walk through the oldest quarters of a modern city. A sense that beneath the pavement and glass and neon, something older is quietly breathing. Civilization, after all, is layered. Not metaphorically but literally. The world we inhabit rests on top of other worlds, built and rebuilt over thousands of years, each generation stacking its homes, its temples, its streets, on the bones of the last. And buried deep in those layers lie the remains of cultures that vanished so thoroughly that today we do not even know their names. Nowhere is this layering more visible than in the ancient settlement of the Middle East, where the first cities rose and fell in cycles that left their fingerprints in the soil. When archaeologists dig into a tell, a mound built unintentionally by millennia of human occupation, they uncover not a single civilization but dozens, each one built atop the ruins of another. But what they often find at the very bottom, in the oldest layers, is not a beginning but a mystery. Architectural complexity that seems too complete, too organized, too coordinated for what should have been a society's first attempt at living together. Take Eridu, often called the earliest city in Mesopotamia. According to later Sumerian tradition, Eridu was the first place where kingship descended from heaven, the birthplace of order, law, and culture. Mythology aside, the archaeological site reveals 18 consecutive temples built atop one another, each new structure carefully constructed over the ruins of the previous one. But what unsettles researchers is that even the earliest temple, buried deep beneath centuries of sand, is not primitive. It displays a level of planning, ritual structure, and spatial organization that implies long traditions behind it. Yet those traditions remain invisible in the soil. Below the first temple, no transitional structures exist, no simpler shrines, no scattered proto-village suggesting gradual cultural evolution. Instead, the earliest layer already feels like the continuation of something older, something we cannot see. At Uruk, one of the world's first major urban centers, the story is similar. The earliest monumental architecture, the Iana precinct, the White Temple, emerges abruptly in the archaeological record. The builders clearly understood large-scale construction, ceremonial planning, and communal labor organization. But where did they learn it? What settlements taught them these techniques? The archaeological layers prior to the monumental phase are thin, hesitant, incomplete. And then suddenly, Uruk transforms into a metropolis. It is tempting to see this as a leap, but all leaps require a starting point, and that starting point remains obscure. Even Kut el Hoyuk, one of the oldest large settlements in the world, complicates the notion of beginnings. Its earliest houses show complex interior divisions, symbolic wall reliefs, burial practices integrated into domestic life, and painted shrines, all appearing without the clear, simpler precedents one might expect. The entire village seems to have been built according to shared norms and cosmological understandings that preceded the archaeological layers themselves. It is as though the people of Kut el Hoyuk brought their traditions with them from somewhere else, a place still undiscovered, still hidden. This is a recurring theme across many ancient sites. Older beginnings seem to be buried beneath settlements, but the layers below often contain nothing but sterile soil or natural deposits. If earlier civilizations existed, their physical remains have either eroded beyond recognition or lie deeper still, beneath strata we have not yet reached. Sometimes, the buried worlds are not literal cities but forgotten cultural phases. In Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth, archaeologists uncovered a massive stone tower and walls dating to around 8000 BCE. These structures are astonishing for their age. Precise engineering, complex planning, large-scale labor. But beneath the tower lie only modest signs of earlier settlement. No gradual architectural experimentation. No weak prototypes. The tower appears as a completed idea, Even more intriguing are the cities that grew vertically rather than horizontally. Places where new populations built directly atop older ruins without understanding or acknowledging what came before. In Troy, 9 cities lie stacked like geological chapters, each one built on the remains of the last. In Athens, the Acropolis sits above older Mycenaean structures once forgotten. In Rome, every street hides earlier Roman, Etruscan, and pre-Etruscan foundations, and beneath those, often nothing we can easily interpret. Modern Istanbul is built atop a Byzantine Constantinople, which rests on Roman Byzantium, which itself covers even older settlements whose names are unknown. Under Mexican cities lie Aztec ruins, and beneath those lie Teotihuacan foundations, and beneath those something older still. Beneath Lima lie colonial structures built atop Inca buildings built atop pre-Inca temples. In Japan, Nara and Kyoto sit atop much older sacred grounds whose original occupants vanished. And yet, many of these older layers present the same puzzle, a society that seems to emerge fully formed in the earliest layer we can access, with customs or architectural knowledge that do not match what little came before. This has led some researchers, quietly, cautiously, to suggest that we might be missing entire cultural phases, erased by later construction, or buried too deeply to detect using current excavation methods. If cities have been built atop earlier cities for thousands of years, how many of those earlier cities survived in forms we could still recognize? Some parts of the world hint at intriguing possibilities. In Japan, the Jomon culture preceded the agricultural Yayoi newcomers by millennia. Jomon artisans created some of the world's oldest pottery, as well as ceremonial figurines, dog, with features so stylized that their meaning remains elusive. Their settlements appear stable, ritualistic, deeply tied to nature. Yet beneath Jomon strata, archaeologists sometimes find hints, not solid evidence but hints, of even older human presence. Scattered tools, isolated hearths, footprints and forgotten sediments. But no clear picture of a society emerges below the Jomon. If one existed, it may lie too deep or be too ephemeral to detect. In the Andes, beneath the ceremonial centers of the Inca, lie layers of earlier Inca, and beneath those lie prairie foundations, and beneath those lie Chavin ceremonial structures, and beneath those lie pre-ceramic settlements. And beneath those, the soil becomes quiet, but not empty. Some regions contain stone alignments and earthworks so eroded that their cultural attributions remain uncertain. These structures hint at societies older than our current models allow, but erosion has stripped them of their context. In South Asia, the Indus Valley cities were built atop earlier settlements, but the earliest layers still appear too advanced for what should be the beginning of an urban tradition. Beneath Harappa's foundations lie signs of proto-urban life. Well-planned layouts, rudimentary drains, standardized brick molds. But even those earliest layers imply a lineage we cannot see. Thus, a troubling question emerges, one repeated across continents. Why do so many first layers feel like middle chapters? Some archaeologists propose that earlier settlements were built from impermanent materials, wood, reed, mud, and would therefore leave little trace. Others point out that repeated flooding, rebuilding, and erosion inevitably erase ancient layers. These are reasonable explanations, yet the sheer consistency of the pattern, civilizations appearing in their earliest excavated phase with developed traditions, is difficult to ignore. Perhaps the problem is not that earlier civilizations never existed, but that we simply lacked the tools or access to find them. Many ancient cities lie beneath modern ones and cannot be excavated. Others sit under floodplains or deserts. Some lie underwater, and many more lie so deep beneath accumulated layers of occupation that reaching them would require dismantling the very cities people still live in. It is entirely possible that beneath our feet, the earliest chapters of civilization remain sealed, not by intention, but by the very continuity of human settlement. And that leads to a final quiet thought. If the ground beneath every ancient city holds the ghosts of even older ones, how many civilizations have vanished into these layers without ever becoming part of history? We walk on streets built atop forgotten worlds, and somewhere below in the darkness, the first stories are still waiting. There's a kind of silence in history that feels deliberate, not because someone chose to erase it, but because the world itself seemed to fall quiet. Entire regions go still, writing ceases, monuments no longer rise, trade stops, cities empty. And in that hush, sometimes lasting centuries, humanity's memory flickers like a candle struggling in the wind. Archaeologists call these periods dark ages, though the term does not imply that people vanished, only that their voices did. Yet for anyone reading the past through its surviving traces, these silences feel like missing pages torn from a book whose story was never meant to be fragmented. One of the most striking examples of such silence occurred in the ancient Near East, after the fall of the Hittite Empire. For nearly 2 millennia, Anatolia had been a complex, interconnected world of states, languages, and literate cultures. Then, around 1200 BCE, the region collapsed. Not slowly, but suddenly. Great cities burned or were abandoned. Royal archives stopped recording. Trade routes dissolved. The political map disintegrated into small scattered communities. For roughly 300 years, few written records survive, not because nobody was writing perhaps, but because the systems that preserved writing had crumbled. When history returns, it does so in a different voice. A similar silence blankets the period following the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations around the same time. Mycenaean palaces fell, Linear B writing disappeared. Coastal cities across the Levant were destroyed or emptied. Egypt survived, but barely, inscribing on its monuments a sense of crisis so deep that even the victors wrote like a people wounded. And then, for nearly a century, the Eastern Mediterranean went quiet. No royal annals, no new monumental inscriptions, no major building projects. Archaeology fills this silence with scattered pottery and fragments of settlement, but these cannot substitute for the lost stories. The result is a historical void so profound that entire centuries had to be reconstructed through inference. What caused this silence? Invaders, climate shifts, systems collapse, famine, plague. The answer remains uncertain because the silence itself is the evidence. A void where explanation should be. One of the most mysterious historical silences lies in the story of the Hittites. After centuries of power, their capital Hattusa was deserted. Their language, once inscribed on thousands of tablets, stopped being written entirely. Their gods vanished from temple walls. For nearly 2,000 years, no one remembered them. They existed only as ghostly references in foreign texts, mentioned as distant figures whose reality scholars doubted until the 20th century. A whole civilization erased, not violently but by the slow fade of memory. Then there was the first Dark Age of China, following the fall of the Western Zhou around 771 BCE. The royal court fled eastward, leaving behind the heartland of early Chinese culture. Bronze inscriptions declined sharply. Ritual systems, meticulously maintained for centuries, fractured. Political power atomized into rival states whose conflicts and alliances were poorly recorded. Later, historians pieced the era together through oral traditions and fragmentary records, but vast portions remain opaque. An entire philosophical world, the transition toward Confucian, Taoist, and legalist thought, germinated in this soil of chaos. But the early stages are shrouded. Even earlier, the fate of the Shang dynasty carries its own voids. Their oracle bones and bronzes reveal a rich ceremonial culture, but much of their historical narrative relied on records that no longer exist. These lost texts may have held explanations for the dynasty's fall, but without them, we can only circle around the gaps. The Indus Valley civilization, as explored earlier, left an even deeper silence. Its writing undeciphered, its internal life unreachable. But its end, the transition from an urban world to smaller rural settlements, also creates a lull in the archaeological signal. Buildings shrink, cities disperse, writing vanishes. It's a dark age not of destruction but of fading complexity, a culture receding until its noise was too soft to hear. In Europe, the departure of Rome left behind a different kind of silence. Roman administration relied heavily on written communication, decrees, tax records, military orders. When the Western Empire collapsed, literacy contracted dramatically. Towns shrank, coinage became rare, long-distance trade weakened. Monasteries preserved some knowledge, but entire genres of writing disappeared. Historians call this the early medieval Dark Age, not because Europe was empty, but because it was quiet in the archaeological and textual record. The people lived, but their voices were faint. What makes these silences so chilling is not simply the absence of information, but the pattern. History seems to fracture along certain fault lines, moments when the record thins inexplicably. Consider the disappearance of the Etruscans. They built sophisticated cities in Italy long before Rome rose to dominance. Their writing survives, but most of it is funerary or administrative, and their literature, once rich, has vanished. Roman authors wrote about them with reference, but their own voices are missing. Even their origins remain mysterious, debated for centuries. Their culture ended not abruptly, but quietly, as Rome absorbed them. Yet the silence around their worldview is disproportionate to their influence. The Maya present another form of historical quietude. After their monumental cities declined in the 9th century, their hieroglyphic writing ceased in many regions, the structures of power dissolved, agricultural centers moved. For centuries after, little was recorded in stone or codices. The people survived, their language continued, their cosmology endured, but their monumental voice went quiet. Sometimes the silence appears in places we do not expect. In sub-Saharan Africa, the Nok culture produced terracotta sculptures of striking expressiveness around 1000 BCE. These figures showed technical skill and symbolic meaning, yet after several centuries the culture disappears from the record. No written language survived, and their subsequent influence remains uncertain. Did they migrate? Were they absorbed? The soil offers only fragments. Even in the highlands of Iran, the Kura-Araxes culture spanned a vast region, creating distinctive architecture and pottery. Then, around 2000 BCE, they vanished, replaced by new cultures whose relationship to the earlier people remains unclear. A cultural horizon ending abruptly, followed by another beginning without explanation. These silences invite speculation, perhaps too much. But the pattern is undeniable. History has moments when the record goes dark, as though someone dimmed the lights. Some researchers suspect climate events played a major role. Tree rings, ice cores, and sediment layers reveal sudden environmental shifts that likely disrupted entire civilizations. The 4.2 kilo-year event, for example, corresponds to collapses in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley. Yet even here the silence is eerie, because it is not accompanied by clear evidence of catastrophe, only by absence. Other scholars point to political instability. When fragmentation occurs, writing systems collapse, archives burn, centralized power disappears. The voices of scholars and priests fall quiet because the institutions that supported them crumble. But another explanation exists, one that feels less scientific yet strangely resonant. Perhaps the world occasionally turns inward. Perhaps there are times when societies lose the will or ability to speak, to record, to declare themselves in stone or ink. Times when the collective memory contracts, whether from trauma, fear, fatigue, or cultural transformation. Times when civilizations forget parts of themselves, not by force, but by necessity. Whatever the cause, The effect is profound. These silences force us to confront the limits of our knowledge. We see only what survived, not what existed. And the gaps, those blank spaces where history should be, become as meaningful as the narratives we do possess. The unsettling question that rises from these quiet centuries is simple, yet immense. If so many periods of history can fall silent, how many entire civilizations might have spoken once and gone quiet forever? There is a moment when, tracing the long arc of human history, when all the scattered mysteries begin to converge, not into an answer, but into a shape made of absences, a shape outlined by what is missing rather than what remains. Across continents, eras, and climates, cultures appear abruptly, flourish unexpectedly, and disappear incompletely, leaving behind fragments too polished to be beginnings and too isolated to be endings. It is in this mosaic of vanishings that an unsettling possibility emerges, that the story of humanity may contain an entire chapter we have not yet learned to see. This chapter does not announce itself through monuments or scripts. It does not present a single civilization rising above others. Instead, it surfaces through patterns, abrupt innovations, unexplained transitions, similarities across distant regions, and silences where continuity should be. It whispers through the polished stones of megalithic builders whose identities vanished, through scripts that record thoughts we can no longer decode, through cities that emerge mature, as if remembering something we cannot grasp, through burial mounds concealing ritual worlds that appear without clear progenitors, through forgotten migrations, submerged coastlines, vanished languages, and cultural cycles scattered, like footprints fading into sand. When we gather these patterns together, what we see is not evidence of a lost global civilization, not a mythic Atlantis, not a vanished techno-society, but something more subtle, more human. A recognition that early complexity might have risen many times before recorded history began, only to fall before its memory could solidify into writing or stone. A recognition that civilization may be less like a straight line and more like a heartbeat, pulsing, pausing, and beginning again. Some archaeologists have hinted at this idea in cautious terms, calling it punctuated evolution or episodic complexity. But beneath these academic phrases lies a deeper implication. The possibility that humanity's first attempts at organized life may be older than the surviving ruins suggest, erased by time, water, ice, migrations, or the simple fragility of early social systems. This possibility becomes more tangible when we consider the rapid emergence of agriculture after the Younger Dryas, the sudden rise of monumental architecture at Göbekli Tepe, and the immediate sophistication of the first city-states in Mesopotamia. It is as if people stepped into the Neolithic not as blank slates, but as inheritors of knowledge carried through oral memory, knowledge that outlasted the societies that first discovered it, knowledge that survived collapse without preserving the identity of its creators. If this is true, then the earliest civilizations we recognize, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, Kerala, may represent not the first sparks of complex society, but the first sparks that managed to endure. Yet endurance is fragile. The world has always been unstable. Sea levels rose, deserts expanded, rivers shifted, volcanoes erupted, climate patterns swung with a violence impossible to ignore. A society living at the edge of survival needed only one misstep, one drought, one failed harvest, for its knowledge to fragment. A single generation without transmission can break the chain of memory. In such a world, complexity might have bloomed many times, but only occasionally left durable traces. Even in recorded history, we see how easily knowledge can vanish. The fall of the Western Roman Empire erased engineering techniques that took 1,000 years to rediscover. The burning of libraries eliminated centuries of accumulated thought. The suppression of oral traditions silenced entire cosmologies. The disappearance of scripts broke the continuity of languages. What survives is often accidental, not representative. If such losses occurred in literate eras, how much more could have been lost before writing existed? This leads to a humbling realization. Perhaps the civilizations we call lost are only the ones for which traces remain. And perhaps those for which no trace remains were just as real, living, building, thinking, praying, before dissolving so completely that archaeology cannot find them. Think of the coastal societies drowned at the end of the Ice Age, villages, harbors, maybe even towns now buried under silt. Think of the Arctic cultures erased by ice and thaw, whose organic materials decayed beyond recognition. Think of rainforest cultures swallowed by vegetation, leaving only faint geoglyphs beneath canopy. Think of nomadic peoples who carried their knowledge in memory, not stone. Think of desert civilizations erased by shifting dunes, their remnants too ephemeral to detect. There is a quiet truth here. Archaeology is not the history of humanity. It is the history of what survived. And far more does not survive than does. Perhaps this is why the earliest layers of so many ancient cities feel incomplete, as though they're referencing something older, something lost. Perhaps this is why certain myths echo similar themes across continents: floods, cycles, eras of destruction and renewal. Myths not literal, but they may encode the emotional memory of repeated collapse. Stories inherited from worlds that vanished before they could leave a physical mark. In this sense, lost civilization does not have to mean a singular advanced society that disappeared. It might instead refer to the many cultures that reached local peaks, developed their own cosmologies and technologies, built structures we might consider monumental, and then fell so thoroughly that only faint echoes remain. Humanity might be far older, culturally speaking, than our ruins suggest. Complex thought, ritual, symbolic art, social hierarchy, architecture. These may have been discovered, forgotten, and rediscovered many times. The archaeological record shows the survivors, not the pioneers. It is unsettling to imagine how much may have slipped through the cracks. Unsettling to consider that for every Göbekli Tepe we uncover, a dozen others may lie buried or eroded beyond recognition. Unsettling to think that the first cities we know might stand atop the graves of older ones. Unsettling to realize that even now, as we build our own world, future ages might see only fragments and assume we were beginning rather than ending. In the end, the idea of an entire missing chapter of humanity does not diminish us. It deepens us. It reminds us that our story is not a straight ascent, but a wandering journey across millennia of forgetting and remembering. It teaches us to listen more carefully to silence, to see meaning in gaps, to imagine the worlds that flickered briefly and left behind only faint traces. And it leaves us with a question, soft but persistent, drifting like dust through the ruins of time. If so many civilizations vanished without leaving a trace, what else, or who else, waits beneath the layers of earth, still unseen, still unspoken, still waiting for us to notice?